The Cathedral of Seville stood as a monument to divine glory, its Gothic spires piercing the heavens, but within its hallowed walls, a different kind of worship was taking place. Father Miguel moved with a grace that seemed almost celestial, his rich baritone voice weaving through the vast nave, capturing every soul present. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass, casting kaleidoscopic patterns over the rapt congregation, each face tilted up toward him like flowers to the sun. They saw only piety, a man so connected to God that his very presence felt like a blessing. They could not see the meticulous calculation behind his beatific smile, the way his eyes, dark and penetrating, catalogued every twitch of anxiety, every shadow of guilt that crossed the faces before him. His sermon was a masterpiece of oration, full of fire and brimstone balanced by tender promises of redemption. He spoke of sin not as an abstract concept, but as a tangible stain upon the soul, a corruption that required fierce, purifying effort to erase. As he paced slowly before the altar, the heavy scent of incense clinging to his vestments, his gaze would linger on the young artisan, whose hands fidgeted with a hidden shame on the merchant who could not meet his eye on the young woman whose devout expression could not mask a deep spiritual doubt. To his flock, these were moments of personal connection, a shepherd tending to his sheep. To Father Miguel, they were a harvest. He raised his arms, the silken fabric of his chasuble flowing like wings, and brought his message to a thunderous close. A collective sigh moved through the crowd, a release of pent-up emotion. As the final notes of the organ faded into the stone vaults, the people began to shuffle out, many crossing themselves, their faith momentarily fortified by the performance. Father Miguel remained at the pulpit, his hands resting gently on the worn wood, offering quiet blessings and warm handshakes. He was the picture of humble devotion. But as the last of the parishioners disappeared into the bright Andalusian afternoon, the warmth in his eyes cooled into something sharp and assessing. He turned and walked slowly toward the shadowy recesses of the north transept, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly empty space. His mind was not on prayers of gratitude. It was already in the confessional, reviewing the vulnerabilities he had noted, weighing the depth of sin against the potential for a satisfying necessary cleansing. The revered priest of Seville had concluded his public mass, and now the private one was about to begin. Mateo, the young woodcarver, whose hands could coax saints from blocks of cedar, was a man known for his quiet devotion, and the slight, perpetual slump of his shoulders, as if carrying a weight only he could feel. He had been a regular at Mass, his eyes often fixed on the intricate carvings of the choir stalls' own handiwork with a look that mingled pride with a deeper, more troubled sentiment. It was this visible burden that had drawn the particular, predatory attention of Father Miguel during his sermons, a flicker of shame that promised a rich vein of transgression to be mined. The confessional, that small, dark box of absolution, became the stage for Mateo's undoing. Within its velvet-smothered silence, he poured out his guilt, a secret so corrosive it had begun to eat at the edges of his soul. He confessed to an envy so potent it felt like a physical sickness, a resentment aimed at a more successful rival that had festered into dark, unchristian wishes. Father Miguel, on the other side of the lattice, listened with the patience of a spider, his voice a low, soothing murmur that encouraged the full, shameful disclosure. He offered not condemnation, but a twisted form of empathy, suggesting that such a profound sin required a profound penance, a private spiritual guidance to truly scour it from his heart. He asked Mateo to meet him after Vespers in the secluded quiet of the sacristy, where they could begin the arduous work of purification. Mateo never returned to his small workshop near the river. His tools lay untouched, a fine layer of dust beginning to settle on the half-finished figure of the Magdalene he had been carving. His absence was not immediate cause for alarm. Artisans sometimes took work in neighboring towns, but as days bled into a week, a low current of unease began to circulate through the tight-knit community around the cathedral. Whispers started in the marketplace, hushed conversations over loaves of bread and pitchers of wine. The woodcarver was a good man, a devout man. He wouldn't just leave. His family, frantic, went to the cathedral authorities. Their inquiries met with calm, practiced deflection. Father Miguel himself expressed deep concern, offering prayers for Mateo's safe return. and suggesting the young man might have been called away on a personal spiritual retreat, perhaps overwhelmed by the fervor of his faith. The explanation was smooth, plausible, and delivered with such convincing sincerity that it temporarily quelled official suspicion. The Church's influence in Seville was a towering, immutable fact, a wall against which mere civilian concern dashed itself to pieces. To question a priest, especially one as revered as Father Miguel, was akin to questioning God himself. No official inquiry was launched. The civil guard, when cautiously approached, exchanged nervous glances and spoke of the respect owed to the diocese. The matter was left to fade, a single, disturbing ripple swallowed by the immense still waters of ecclesiastical authority. But the whisper of Mateo's name did not fully die. It lingered in the shaded courtyards and narrow alleys, a ghost of a question mark hanging over the city. The first silent scream in what was to become a chorus of the vanished. The cathedral's public grandeur was a lie. Its true heart beat in the dark, far below the feet of the faithful. After the last echoes of the evening prayers had faded, and the great doors were bolted shut, Father Miguel moved through the sacristy with a purpose that was both ritual and compulsion. The air grew colder as he left the last of the candlelight behind, his footsteps the only sound in the consuming silence. He paused before a section of the wall that appeared no different from any other, its stones worn smooth by centuries. But his fingers knew the secret, finding a nearly invisible seam and applying pressure to a specific point. With a soft, grinding sigh that sounded like the earth itself shifting, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow, descending staircase carved from the bedrock upon which the cathedral stood. A damp mineral smell rose from the opening, the breath of the deep earth. Father Miguel took a heavy iron lantern from a hidden niche, its flame casting long, leaping shadows that made the wall seem to writhe. He began his descent, the stone steps worn into shallow dips by generations of feet, though he was certain his were the only ones to tread here in a very long time. The air grew thick and heavy, the silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against the ears. This was a place outside of time, a secret buried beneath layers of prayer and stone. The stairs ended in a low, vaulted passageway, its ceiling just high enough for him to pass without stooping. The lantern light glistened on wet patches on the walls, and the sound of his own breathing was unnaturally loud. He moved with the familiarity of one walking through his own home, each turn and each arch known to him in intimate detail. Finally, the passage opened into a chamber that was not a natural crypt, but a room clearly fashioned for a singular, grim purpose. The chamber was circular, its walls lined with ancient rust-stained manacles bolted directly into the stone. A heavy wooden table stood in the center, its surface scarred and dark in patches, with leather restraints dangling from its sides. Shelves held an array of implements that gleamed dully in the lantern-light tools, whose shapes suggested a terrible utility. The air here was different, tainted with a metallic sharpness that clung to the back of the throat, overlaying the scent of damp and dust. This was not a place of penance, but of extraction. This was where Father Miguel conducted his true ministry, in the absolute silence beneath the sanctity, where no prayer from above could ever hope to be heard. In the stillness of that underground chamber, surrounded by the instruments of his dark craft, Father Miguel felt not guilt, but a profound and chilling sense of purpose. The silence was not empty. It was full of his conviction. He ran his fingers along the cold edge of the table, his mind tracing the contours of his twisted theology. Each soul he brought down here was not a victim, but a patient. Each scream was not a cry of agony, but a hymn of purification. He saw himself not as a monster, but as a surgeon of the spirit, cutting away the rod of sin so that grace might find a clean wound in which to grow, believed with a fanatic's unshakable certainty that the world above was drowning in a comfortable, complacent corruption. People whispered their sins in the confessional and received a few prayers in return, a hollow transaction that left the core of their moral decay untouched. True absolution, he was convinced, required a currency of pain. It was the fire that burned away impurity, the scalpel that excised the festering parts of the soul. The agony he inflicted was a gift, the highest form of spiritual mercy he could offer. He was saving them. He was giving them a chance at a purity they could never achieve through whispered words and light penance. His thoughts turned to Matteo, the woodcarver. The boy's envy had been a black knot in his heart, a sin that simple prayer could never unravel. Here, in the sacred silence below, Father Miguel had worked to untie it. He remembered the clarity in Matteo's eyes at the end, past the terror and the pain of raw, stripped bare acceptance. That, to Miguel, was the face of redemption. It was a look he sought to cultivate in all of them, the moment when the self was scourged away and only the soul remained, waiting for God's grace. He was their shepherd, leading them through the valley of the shadow of death, so they might fear no evil. The chains, the tools, the darkness, these were merely the necessary implements of a love so severe it could only be expressed through suffering. He was not a torturer, he was a redeemer. And in the absolute authority of the chamber, with the weight of the cathedral and his God above him, his justification felt as solid and immovable as the stone itself. The air in La Giralda Tavern was thick with the smell of cheap wine and unspoken fear. Men huddled over their cups, their voices low, their eyes darting toward the door as if expecting a specter to materialize from the twilight streets of Seville. Another young man had vanished, a baker's apprentice this time, last seen heading toward the cathedral for guidance. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, a sinister rhythm pulsing beneath the daily life of the city. Matteo the woodcarver was no longer an isolated tragedy, but the first note in a dreadful melody. Faces, usually animated by gossip and laughter, were now drawn and somber. A grizzled old cobbler traced the rim of his clay cup, his voice a gravelly murmur as he recounted how his own nephew had grown distant before he, too, stopped appearing at family meals. A merchant, his fine clothes looking out of place in the dim tavern, leaned in and mentioned a debt collector known for his sharp tongue who had simply ceased to exist. None dared speak the obvious connection aloud. Their gazes would flicker toward the cathedral's silhouette against the darkening sky, its spires like accusing fingers, and then quickly away, as if the mere act of looking might draw unwanted attention. The church was the bedrock of their world, the source of order, comfort, and ultimate authority. To question it was to question the very foundation of their existence. So, the accusations remained trapped behind clenched teeth, the suspicions curdling into a shared, silent dread that hung heavier than the tobacco smoke. They spoke in circles, using vague terms, bad luck, strange times, the devil's work, anything to avoid naming the unthinkable. The fear was a palpable entity in the room, fed by every nervous glance and every sentence left unfinished. They were caught in a terrible bind. Their growing certainty about the source of the evil warring with a lifetime of ingrained reverence and the very practical terror of heavenly and earthly retribution. The whispers were growing, but they were whispers of helplessness. The sound of a community realizing a monster walks among them, wearing the face of their salvation. Isabel's fingers, usually so sure and steady as they guided needle and thread through the finest silks, trembled as she clutched her rosary. The recent disappearances had sown a deep unease in her, but it was a more personal shadow that drove her to the cathedral. Gnawing private doubt about the goodness of a God who would allow such suffering in the world. She had come seeking solace, but found instead the penetrating gaze of Father Miguel, who seemed to see the turmoil in her soul as clearly as if it were written on her forehead. After Mass, he approached her with a gentleness that felt like a balm. His voice was a low, reassuring hum, his words carefully chosen to mirror her own unspoken fears. He spoke of spiritual crises not as failures of faith, but as opportunities for profound growth, for a deeper, more authentic connection with the divine. He suggested that her doubts were not a sin, but a sign of a soul ripe for true enlightenment, and he offered his guidance, thoughtful sessions away from the distractions of the world, where they could explore her questions in the quiet sanctity of the cathedral after hours. 2. Isabel, isolated by her fears and yearning for reassurance, his offer felt like a lifeline. Here was a man of God, revered and respected, seeing not a faithless woman but a seeker worthy of his personal attention. The promise of clarity, of having her spiritual burdens lifted by such a wise counselor, overshadowed the faint warning chill that prickled at the back of her neck. She agreed to meet him the following evening, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks, completely unaware that the hand extended in spiritual Guidance was the same that turned the key in the lock of the hidden chamber deep below. Desperation has a certain weight, a heaviness that settles in the bones and drags at the spirit. For Mateo's family, that weight had become unbearable. His mother's face was a landscape of grief, etched with lines that had not been there a fortnight before. His father's hands, calloused from a lifetime of honest labor, now hung uselessly at his sides, clenched into impotent fists. The quiet hope that their son had simply wandered off had curdled into a cold, certain dread. The whispers in the tavern, the sidelong glances in the market, all pointed toward the one place they dared not accuse the cathedral. But love, in its raw and frantic state, can shatter even the deepest taboos. They approached the barracks of the civil guard with the hesitant steps of those entering a foreign land. The building, with its stark, official air, seemed to repel them. Inside, the air smelled of leather, sweat, and the faint, metallic scent of fear. They were received with a bureaucratic politeness that felt like a dismissal. The sergeant behind the desk listened, his expression a mask of professional neutrality. As Mateo's father haltingly laid out their fears, his voice cracking on his son's name. He mentioned the last confession, the meeting with Father Miguel, the pattern that was becoming horrifyingly clear to anyone who cared to look. At the mention of the priest in the cathedral, the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. The sergeant's neutral mask tightened. He exchanged a swift, loaded glance with a junior officer leaning against a far wall. The unspoken rule of Seville hung between them, as tangible as the stone walls of the barracks itself. The church was beyond their reach. To formally investigate its property, to question one of its most prominent priests on nothing more than the terrified suspicions of a craftsman's family, was not just imprudent. It was political and professional suicide. The sergeant offered vague assurances. He promised to make inquiries, to keep an eye out. His words were empty vessels, meant to placate and usher them back out into the street. He spoke of the respect owed to the diocese, of the lack of any concrete evidence, of the many reasons a young man might choose to leave his life behind. It was a masterclass in passive obstruction, delivered with a weary efficiency that spoke of having given this same speech before. The family was gently, firmly, turned away, their desperation met with a wall of reluctant authority. They walked back into the sunlit plaza, the majestic facade of the cathedral looming over them, now seeming less a house of God and more a fortress. Its secrets guarded not just by stone and silence, but by the very institutions meant to protect the people. Their search had ended where it began, in helpless, terrified silence. The confessional booth was a theater of the soul, and Father Miguel was its sole, unseen director. In the dim, claustrophobic space, fragrant with the scent of old wood and beeswax, he sat perfectly still, a shadow behind the ornate lattice. Parishioners came and went, their voices trembling with the weight of their transgressions, each one unknowingly auditioning for a role in his private passion play. He listened, not with a shepherd's compassion, but with a predator's discernment, his mind a finely tuned instrument for detecting the precise frequency of shame that signaled a soul ripe for his particular brand of redemption. A merchant confessed to cheating his partners, his voice slick with false contrition. A young wife whispered of a fleeting desire for a man not her husband. A soldier spoke of the faces of those he had killed, not in battle, but in cold anger. Father Miguel offered each the same measured tones of absolution, the same prescribed prayers for penance. But internally he was cataloging, weighing the depth of their corruption against their strength of spirit. The merchant's sin was venal, but his repentance shallow. He would break to Isoli, his suffering yielding little spiritual fruit. The wife's desire was a common weakness, hardly worth the effort. But the soldier, his guilt was a live thing, coiled and venomous. It had weight, it had teeth. That was a soul worth saving. Oh, he waited, patient as a stone in a river, until the right one came along. An older woman, her voice frayed with a lifetime of bitterness, confessed to poisoning her neighbor's well out of spite years ago, a secret that had festered like a wound. Her sin was not just an act, but a part of her character, a core of malice that she had nurtured. As she spoke, Father Miguel's fingers, resting on his knees, curled slightly. Here was a profound corruption, a soul so steeped in venom that only the most extreme measures could possibly draw it out. He offered her comfort, his voice a soft lie, and suggested a series of private spiritual consultations to help her truly unburden her conscience. He could almost feel her relief through the wooden partition, a lamb gratefully walking into the slaughterhouse. The trap was set. The confessional had once again delivered him exactly what he needed. The cathedral at dusk was a different kind of sacred, a vast, silent cavern where shadows pooled in the corners like spilled ink, and the last of the day's light fell in dusty slanting columns through the high windows. Isabel's footsteps were small, hesitant things against the immense silence, each one echoing faintly in the cavernous nave. She clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, not against the chill, but against the profound and sudden loneliness of the place. The familiar pews were empty, the altar a distant, shadowy tableau. This was not the comforting house of God she knew from Sunday Mass. This was something older, quieter, and infinitely more watchful. Father Miguel moved ahead of her, a dark silhouette against the gloom, his presence both a comfort and a source of her unease. He had met her at the small side door with a quiet smile, his manner as soothing as it had been the day before. He spoke of the peace found in the empty church, of how the absence of the congregation allowed for a more direct communion with the divine. His words were a balm to her troubled spirit, yet they could not entirely silence the small, insistent voice in the back of her mind that wondered why such communion had to happen in the deepening dark, away from all other eyes, led her not toward the main altar or the familiar chapels, but along a side aisle that curved into the deeper recesses of the transept, where the light from the windows did not reach. The air grew cooler, smelling of cold stone and extinguished candles. Isabel's heart began a slow, heavy drumming against her ribs. This felt less like a path to spiritual clarity and more like a descent into something hidden. She glanced back toward the distant door, a rectangle of fading twilight that seemed suddenly miles away. She told herself it was foolishness, a product of her own nervous imagination and the recent fears that had gripped the city. This was Father Miguel, a man of God. She was safe. He paused before a heavy iron-studded door she had never noticed before, half concealed behind a tapestry depicting the martyrdom of a saint. He produced a large ancient key from within his robes. The metallic scrape of it turning in the lock was shockingly loud in the silence, a sound that felt final. He pushed the door open, revealing not a chapel or a sacristy, but a narrow descending stairway that vanished into absolute blackness. A breath of damp earth's chilled air sighed out from the darkness, carrying with it a faint coppery temps that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Father Miguel turned to her, his face a mask of serene invitation, but his eyes, in the deep shadow, seemed to have swallowed all the light in the cavernous church. He gestured for her to precede him. Isabel's feet felt rooted to the stone floor, every instinct screaming at her to turn and run, but the weight of his expectation, the fear of offending him, and the desperate hope for the answers he promised held her frozen. She took a single, fateful step forward, crossing the threshold into the waiting dark. The darkness swallowed her whole. The air, thick and cold and tasting of wet earth and something faintly metallic, filled her lungs like a physical weight. The door groaned shut behind her, the sound of the heavy bolt sliding home a final, terrifying punctuation to her mistake. Before her eyes could adjust, before a scream could fully form in her throat, a hand clamped over her mouth, the grip impossibly strong. The fabric of a priest's robe rough against her cheek. Her world narrowed to a frantic, muffled struggle in the absolute black, her body seized by an iron strength that betrayed the gentle facade of the man who had lured her here. She was dragged, her heels scraping uselessly against the worn stone steps, her struggles as ineffective as a moth beating against a closed window. The descent was a blur of disorientation and raw terror. Her muffled cries were absorbed by the ancient stone, the sound dying inches from her lips. Unheard by anyone but the man who held her and the shadows that watched. The air grew colder, damper, the darkness now punctuated by the faint, dancing glow of a lantern ahead, casting monstrous leaping shapes on the walls of a low passageway. Then they were in the chamber. The lantern light revealed the nightmare in stark, horrific details, the manacles, the scarred table, the tools laid out with a dreadful precision. The sight stole the breath from her lungs, her mind refusing to accept the reality of it. This was not a place of prayer. This was a butcher's yard for the soul. She was thrown against the cold stone wall, the impact jarring her bones. And before she could scramble away, iron cuffs were snapped shut around her wrists, the cold metal biting into her skin. Her final stifled scream was not one of pain, but of utter world-shattering betrayal. The last thing she saw before a blindfold was tied roughly over her eyes was Father Miguel's face, illuminated by the lantern's guttering flame. The gentle counselor was gone. In his place was a figure of calm, focused intensity, his eyes devoid of anything she would recognize as human, looking upon her not as a person, but as a project, a soul in need of his terrible, merciful correction. The ancient stones, witnesses 2 centuries of faith, now bore witness to a new kind of sacrament, one conducted in absolute silence and utter despair. The stench of cheap ink and stale tobacco clung to the captain's office, stark contrast to the crisp, incense-laden air of the cathedral that haunted his thoughts. Captain Alvaro sat behind a desk littered with reports, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he stared at the growing list of names. Mateo, the baker's apprentice, now Isabel. The pattern was a serpent coiling around the heart of the city. In its head, he was certain, lay within the hallowed walls of the cathedral. The whispers from the tavern had hardened into a cold, professional certainty in his mind. He saw it in the fearful eyes of the families who came to him, in the way all trails of inquiry led to the same imposing doors, and then went cold, severed by the unspoken authority of the church. He could no longer ignore the gnawing in his gut, the soldier's instinct that screamed of a predator operating under the cloak of divinity. Gathering his notes, a collection of timid statements and circumstantial but damning connections, sought out his superior. The commandant's office was larger, better appointed, with a large window overlooking the plaza and the cathedral's formidable silhouette. The man himself, Commandant Ruiz, listened with a face of granite, his eyes never leaving Alvaro's as the captain laid out his suspicions, his voice low and urgent. When Alvaro finished, the silence in the room was heavier than any condemnation. Ruiz leaned back in his leather chair, the creak of it loud in the stillness. He steepled his own fingers, his gaze drifting past Alvaro to the cathedral beyond the glass. His words, when they came, were measured, cold, and final. He spoke not of evidence or duty, but of stability, of the delicate balance of power in Seville, of the riots that could erupt, the careers that would be ended, the profound, unthinkable chaos that would follow if the civil guard were to openly accuse the church of harboring a monster. He called it a political reality. He called it prudence. He warned Alvaro, in terms that were perfectly clear yet never explicit, to let the matter lie, to allow the whispers to remain whispers. The church would handle its own affairs, as it always had. The commandant's dismissal was not just an order. It was a door slamming shut on justice, bolted fast by fear and pragmatism. Alvaro left the office with the bitter taste of complicity in his mouth, his conviction now shackled by the very chain of command he was sworn to uphold. The scent of damp wool and old stone, the chill of a flagstone floor on bare knees, these were the first sensations of Miguel's childhood, long before he understood the weight of a chasuble or the intoxicating power of a pulpit. His world had been the monastery of San, a severe fortress of faith perched in the arid hills outside, where the sun beat down mercilessly by day and the cold seeped from the stones by night. It was not a home, but a crucible. He had been given to the brothers at the age of 7, a sickly to quiet boy whose family saw his delicate constitution as a sign of divine calling, or perhaps simply a burden they were relieved to be rid of. The discipline began as soon as he could hold a psalter. The brothers, their faces lean and etched with a joyless piety, preached that the body was a vessel of sin, and that only through rigorous denial could the spirit hope to emerge pure. For a forgotten verse of Scripture, a bowl of thin gruel would be withheld. For a moment of inattention during prayers, the sting of a birch switch across his palms. For the mortal sin of childish laughter, hours kneeling on the rough-hewn chapel floor, the stones biting into his tender knees until they were raw and bleeding. The pain was never called punishment. It was called correction. It was called love. Miguel learned the lexicon of this harsh love well. He learned to flinch at the sound of a certain footstep in the corridor, to school his features into blank submission, to swallow his tears, before they could be seen as a sign of weakness, another failing to be scourged away. His world narrowed to a cycle of chant, labor, and pain, all administered under the watchful, disapproving eyes of men who seemed carved from the same cold granite as the monastery walls. He was taught that every ache, every hunger pang, every humiliation was a step closer to God, a stripping away of the selfish, worldly self. The other boys, those who cried openly or rebelled, were broken quickly and utterly. Miguel, with his preternatural stillness and watchful eyes, did not break. He bent, and in bending, he absorbed the terrible lesson at the core of his upbringing, that suffering was not merely a path to purity, it was purity itself. The switch, the hunger, the cold stone, these were not tools of cruelty, but the loving instruments of a salvation that could only be earned through agony. Among the granite-faced brothers, one figure stood apart, not for his kindness, but for the chilling intensity of his focus. Father Alonso was a man whose eyes held no warmth, only the sharp, assessing glint of a master craftsman evaluating raw material. He saw in the young, preternaturally still Miguel, not just a devout novice, but a perfect, unformed vessel for his own twisted philosophy. While the other brothers meted out punishment for infractions, Father Alonso administered pain as a sacrament. He took Miguel under his wing, a privilege that felt more like a sentence, isolating him for private instruction that stretched long into the frigid nights. In the stark confines of his cell, by the guttering light of a single tallow candle, Father Alonso would speak. His voice was a dry, papery rustle, yet it carried an undeniable, hypnotic authority. He preached a gospel of absolute purity, a state he claimed could never be achieved through prayer or good works alone. The world, he whispered, was a cesspool of softness and compromise. True devotion required a hardness of spirit, a will forged in the fires of extremity. He taught Miguel that the flesh was not just weak, but deceitful, a liar that clouded the soul with its cravings and comforts. And the only language it truly understood was pain. He described pain not as a punishment, but as a divine chisel. It was the tool God used to sculpt the soul, to chip away the imperfections of ego, desire, and worldly attachment. A soul spared suffering, he claimed, was a soul left rough and unfinished, doomed to wallow in its own corruption. But a soul that had been broken open by agony was rendered porous, empty, ready to be filled with the pure, unadulterated light of God's grace. He would have Miguel hold his hand over the candle flame not as a penance for some minor sin, but as an exercise in focus, in learning to separate the screaming of the flesh from the stillness of the spirit waiting beneath. These sessions planted a seed in the fertile, barren soil of Miguel's upbringing. The constant, casual cruelty of the monastery had taught him to endure. Father Alonso's tutelage taught him to revere. The switch and the hunger were no longer just things to be borne. They were holy instruments. The line between torment and transcendence blurred, then vanished entirely. By the time Miguel left the monastery, ordained and sent to Seville, the seed had taken root and grown into a monstrous, unshakable certainty. The lessons of Father Alonso were not a memory. They were his operating principle, the sacred truth that justified the darkness festering in the catacombs beneath the cathedral. He was not continuing a cycle of abuse. He was fulfilling his divine calling, a faithful disciple practicing the severe, loving ministry his mentor had so perfectly exemplified. The scent of oranges and spice clung to Raphael, a merchant's perfume that seemed out of place amidst the cathedral's chill air of sanctity and secrecy. He had come to Seville with a wagon laden with Valencian goods, his visit a semi-annual tradition that broke the monotony of his brother's ascetic life. He found Father Miguel in the quiet sacristy, meticulously polishing a silver chalice with a soft cloth, his movements slow and precise, almost ritualistic. Raphael's booming greeting, full of the warmth of the open road and the vitality of the marketplace, seemed to strike the stone walls and fall dead at his feet. Miguel looked up, and the smile that touched his lips was a practiced, bloodless thing that did not reach his eyes. It was the smile from the pulpit, the one he offered his congregation, beatific, distant, and utterly impersonal. Raphael, who had known the boy before the priest, felt a cold finger trace its way down his spine. The brother, he remembered, though always serious, had possessed a light behind his eyes, a quick, sharp intelligence that sometimes, rarely, would kindle into humor. The man before him now was an effigy of that boy, carved from something cold and polished to a high, impenetrable gloss. They spoke of trivial things Raphael's trade, their mother's health, the unseasonable heat. But Raphael's merchant's eye, trained to read the subtlest shifts in a client's demeanor, saw the fissures in his brother's composure. Miguel's hands, though steady on the chalice, were too still, as if any unscripted movement might betray a tremor. His gaze, when it met Raphael's, was focused yet oddly vacant, like a man looking through a window at a world he no longer inhabited. There was a new weight to his silence, a density that felt less like contemplation and more like a thing buried alive. Raphael mentioned the unrest in the city, the whispers about missing people. He watched his brother closely. Miguel's reaction was a masterclass in control. He expressed a sorrow so generalized it was meaningless, priestly concern for the spiritual well-being of his flock, and then smoothly pivoted the conversation back to the safe, shallow waters of family news. But in that fleeting moment before he spoke, Raphael had seen it a flicker in the depths of his brother's eyes, something ancient and dark and utterly withdrawn. Agaradea, it was not the look of a shepherd worried for his sheep. It was the look of something that lived deep in the woods, something that knew the taste of blood and the comfort of shadows. Raphael left the cathedral with his spices and his oranges, but the warmth of the Andalusian sun could not dispel the chill that had settled in his bones. His successful, revered brother was a stranger. The space he occupied in the world felt less like a holy office and more like a beautifully maintained tomb. The silence of the archbishop's private study was a different quality from that of the cathedral's Navlik, expensive and complicit. Here the whispers of the city did not penetrate. The only sounds were the soft crackle of a dying fire in the hearth and the slow, measured turning of a vellum page as Monsignor Valdezaman, his jowls spoke of a lifetime of good living, read the latest, carefully worded report. It was one of several such documents that had crossed his ornate desk in recent months. It's more troubling than the last. Each met with the same deliberate, practiced inaction. He was not alone. Seated across from him in a backed leather chair was Father Guillermo, a lean, ascetic man who served as the diocese's unofficial archivist and keeper of its most unpleasant secrets. His fingers, stained with ink, were steepled thoughtfully. They spoke in the coded language of power and preservation, their conversation a dance around the unmentionable truth festering in their own basement. They did not speak of torture chambers or vanished souls. They spoke of unfortunate fervor, of overzealous pastoral methods, of the delicate balance that must be maintained for the greater good of the Church as authority and not, incidentally, its considerable earthly holdings. Monsignor Valdez sighed, a sound of profound weariness that was itself a kind of luxury. He acknowledged the pattern, the disturbing consistency of the disappearances that seemed to orbit Father Miguel like dark moons. But his concern was not for the lost. His concern was for the potential scandal, the rupture in the faithful's devotion, the dangerous questions it could raise. The Inquisition was a fading memory, but its shadow still loomed. And the Church could not afford to be seen as fallible, as capable of harboring such a monster within its ranks. A public reckoning would be a catastrophe. Father Guillermo, his voice a dry whisper, laid out the pragmatic calculus. Father Miguel, for all his successes, was a phenomenally popular priest. His sermons filled the coffers with donations. His fervor inspired a fear and devotion that kept the populace in line. And, perhaps most importantly, his actions, in their own horrific way, served a purpose. He eliminated the problematic, the doubt-ridden, the potential sources of dissent before their spiritual unease could spread. He was a self-appointed, albeit extreme purifier, and the results, while messy, ultimately reinforced the Church's image of absolute moral authority. To stop him would be to admit they had ever allowed it to open a wound that could bleed the diocese dry. A silent understanding passed between the two men. They would not act. They would not investigate. They would ensure the civil guard remained a neutered, hesitant entity. They would turn a magnificently blind eye, burying any official inquiry under layers of bureaucracy and feigned ignorance. They would protect the institution at all costs, even if the cost was their own silence in the face of unspeakable evil. The unseen network was not one of active conspiracy, but of passive, self-serving corruption. It was a web of winks and nods of documents misfiled and concerns dismissed, all designed to maintain the glorious gilded facade of the Church, while deep below its foundations, one of their own, conducted his bloody ministry, utterly unchallenged. The scratch of Elena's quill was the only sound in the close, paper-scented darkness of her small scriptorium, a counterpoint to the uneasy silence that had fallen over Seville. The candle on her desk guttered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the stacks of ledgers and copied manuscripts seem like a city of ghosts. But Elena's focus was not on the account books or liturgical texts that provided her meager living. Before her lay a fresh sheet of vellum, and on it she was meticulously constructing a map of the damned. Isabel's absence was a raw personal wound. The two women had shared confidences over mending and cups of bitter tea, their friendship a quiet anchor in the bustling life of the city. Isabel's doubts about her faith, her search for meaning, these were not sins to be punished, but the honest struggles of a seeking heart. And now she was gone, vanished into the same terrible silence that had swallowed Matteo and the others. The official story of a spiritual retreat was a lie that curdled in Elena's stomach. Grief sharpened into a cold, precise anger. Her work as a scribe had taught her the power of information, the patterns that emerged from careful record-keeping. She applied those skills to a darker purpose. She began with the names, writing them in a clean, steady hand. Matteo, Carlos the baker's apprentice, Isabel, Lorenzo the beggar, whose absence few had even noted. She noted the dates, cross-referencing them with the cathedral's liturgical calendar from the copies she had made for the diocese. A pattern began to emerge, subtle but undeniable. Each disappearance occurred within a day of a major feast day or a particularly fiery sermon. From Father Miguel on the perils of sin, she then mapped their last known movements, piecing together fragments from whispered conversations, from the fearful testimonies of family members who had come to her, knowing her friendship with Isabel and her discreet nature. The trails all converged with the grim inevitability of pilgrims on a path. The artisan last seen heading to a private meeting for spiritual guidance. The apprentice who never returned from confession. The seamstress, lured by promises of solace. The beggar who frequented the cathedral plaza. Every path ended at the heavy oak doors of the cathedral. Elena's blood ran cold, not with fear, but with a terrifying certainty. This was no coincidence, no series of unrelated tragedies. It was a design, harvest, timed to the church's own rhythms and executed under its sacred roof. She carefully blotted the ink, her hand trembling only slightly. This was not just a list of names. It was an accusation, written in a script as sharp and clear as the truth it revealed. The quiet scribe, surrounded by the words of saints and scholars, had become an unwilling chronicler of a saint's corruption. And her investigation had just begun to unearth the terrible geometry of his sin. Lorenzo knew the cathedral's shadows better than anyone. They were his home, his shelter from the sun's glare and the watchful eyes of the city guard. His world was the sun-warmed stone of the plaza by day and the deep protective alcoves by night, a life measured in alms and ignored glances. But a beggar's invisibility was a double-edged sword. It allowed him to see things others missed, to become a silent witness to the comings and goings that the bustling crowds never noticed. He had seen the young seamstress, Isabel, her face pale and hopeful, entering the side gate long after the last mass had ended. He had seen the priest's solicitous manner, the way his hand had rested on her arm, guiding her into the darkness within. And he had seen that the priest emerged alone much later, his expression not one of pastoral satisfaction but of a strange, focused emptiness, like a man returning from a hard but necessary task. This knowledge sat uneasily in Lorenzo's gut, a cold stone of suspicion amidst the constant gnaw of hunger. He tried to dismiss it, to bury it under the more immediate concerns of where his next crust of bread would come from. But the memory persisted, sharpening his awareness. He began to watch Father Miguel more closely, noting the precise, almost predatory stillness with which the priest would sometimes survey the plaza from the cathedral steps, his gaze sweeping over the crowd without truly seeing them, as if looking for something or someone specific. Father Miguel, in turn, had begun to notice the watchful beggar. The man's constant presence, once part of the scenery, now felt like an accusation. There was a new sharpness in the beggar's eyes when they flickered toward him, a knowingness that pricked at Miguel's carefully constructed composure. He could not risk a loose thread, a pair of eyes that had seen too much. A beggar's word held no weight against a priest's, but whispers had a way of spreading, of finding fertile ground in a city already thick with fear. Lorenzo's silence was no longer assumed. It had become a variable that needed to be controlled, a soul that, in its own way, required securing. The invitation was issued with a chilling benevolence. Father Miguel approached Lorenzo not with suspicion, but with an offer of Christian charity, a warm meal, and a bed for the night in a small, dry storage room within the cathedral's precincts, away from the autumn chill. To a man who slept on stone, it was an unimaginable kindness. Lorenzo's wariness was instantly drowned by a surge of desperate gratitude. He saw the offer as a blessing, a moment of divine grace finally shining upon him. He could not see the calculation behind the priest's smile, the way it was a key turning in a lock. He followed Father Miguel willingly into the deepening twilight, his heart light with a hope that was his final, fatal mistake. The cathedral's great door closed behind them, sealing his fate as surely as it had sealed the others. The fourth victim had just walked into the trap, his gratitude the very bait that had ensnared him. The scent of his brother's quarters was a familiar blend of beeswax, old parchment, and the faint, dry aroma of sanctitia smell Raphael had always associated with Miguel's removed and orderly life. He had come to return a book he'd borrowed weeks ago, a volume of merchant ledgers Miguel had expressed a clinical interest in, perhaps as a window into the worldly concerns he so publicly disdained. Finding the room empty, Raphael placed the book on the precisely ordered desk, his merchant's eye unconsciously noting the stark absence of personal effects. It was a cell, not a home, a space as curated and impersonal as the man himself. As he turned to leave, the toe of his boot caught on a slight unevenness in the worn floorboard near the leg of the heavy oak desk. A soft scrape echoed in the quiet room. Frowning, he knelt, running his fingers over the spot. One plank was slightly higher than its neighbors, its edge worn smoother by the passage of time or by use. Curiosity that most human of impulses overrode his sense of propriety. He worked his fingernails into the narrow gap and pried. The board lifted with a reluctant creak, revealing a shallow, dusty cavity beneath. There was no trove of hidden gold, no stash of forbidden letters. There was only a single object lying alone in the hollowed-out space, as if it were the room's dark, secret heart. It was a key, but unlike any he had ever seen. Forged from blackened iron, it was long and heavy, its bow an ornate, twisted design that looked less like a functional tool and more like a pagan sigil. The teeth were complex, a series of jagged peaks and deep valleys that spoke of a lock meant to guard something of immense importance or to keep something terrifyingly contained. Raphael lifted it, the metal cold and unnaturally heavy in his palm. It felt wrong. It felt like a thing that did not belong in his brother's world of prayers and psalters. This was not a key to a sacristy cabinet or a library door. This was a key for dungeons, for chests bound with iron bands, for gates that were never meant to be opened. His mind flashed to the dark, withdrawn look in Miguel's eyes, to the chilling rumors that clung to the cathedral like a miasma, to the profound and unsettling silence that had greeted his own subtle inquiries. The key in his hand was a physical answer to a question he had been too afraid to ask aloud. It was a seed of dread, cold and metallic, and it had just taken root in the palm of his hand. He carefully replaced the floorboard, the simple act feeling like the sealing of a tomb, and slipped the key into his pocket, its weight a guilty, burning secret against his leg. The key was a brand in his pocket, its weight and cold shape a constant, accusing presence through the long afternoon and into the evening. Raphael tried to lose himself in the mundane rituals of his trade, checking his stock of spices, tallying accounts, but his mind was a trapped bird beating against the cage of that single terrible discovery. The image of the key's pagan intricacy, its obvious age and purpose, refused to be dismissed. It was a key that did not belong to the world of light and prayer his brother inhabited. It belonged to the world of secrets, of things locked away and forgotten. It belonged to the whispers. The nightfall over Seville brought a velvet darkness that did little to soothe his unease. The bustling sounds of the city faded into a watchful quiet, broken only by the distant bark of a dog or the mournful cry of a watchman. The cathedral, a monstrous silhouette against the starry sky, seemed to draw all the shadows of the plaza toward itself, a vortex of silence and hidden things. Compelled by a dread he could no longer suppress, Raphael found his feet carrying him back across the cobblestones. The heavy iron key, a cold lodestone in his grasp. He avoided the main doors, moving instead through the narrow, shadow-cloaked alleys that ran like veins behind the great edifice. He remembered a small, disused postern gate from their childhood, a secret they had used during games of hide and seek, long before the weight of the priesthood had settled on Miguel's shoulders. The gate was half hidden by a thorny bougainvillea, its ironwork rusted, but its mechanism still sound. The black key fit perfectly. The lock turned with a groan that seemed to tear a wound in the night's silence, and the gate swung inward on protesting hinges. The inside of the cathedral was a cavern of absolute blackness, the familiar vastness rendered alien and threatening by the absence of light and life. The moonlight filtering through the high stained-glass windows did not illuminate, but distorted, casting fragmented colored shadows that slithered across the floor. Raphael's own breathing was deafening in the immense quiet. He moved on instinct, guided by a terrible certainty, retracing the path he imagined his brother would take. Away from the nave, deeper into the administrative heart of the building, toward the older, more secretive sections, and then he heard it. At first it was so faint, he thought it a trick of the wind whistling through some unseen crack in the ancient stone. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He held his breath, straining his ears against the crushing silence. There it was, again a sound that was not of the wind. A thin, high, desperate sound, muffled by layers of earth and stone, but unmistakable. It was a human cry, stretched to its breaking point, a sob of utter despair or agony so profound it had been stripped of all other meaning. It seemed to rise from the very foundations of the cathedral, a whisper from the underworld, a sound that had no right to exist in this house of God. The blood drained from Raphael's face. The key in his hand was no longer just a curious object. It was a nightmare made manifest. The whispers were not rumors. They were real. They had a voice. And that voice was screaming from somewhere deep beneath his feet. Trapped in the darkness, his brother held the key too. The revered priest of Seville was not just a withdrawn, troubled man. He was a jailer, a monster. And Raphael was standing directly above his dungeon, listening to its awful, pleading music. Captain Alvaro's office had become a cage of his own conscience. The list of names: Mateo, Carlos, Isabel. Lorenzo glared up at him from the desk, each one a silent accusation of his inaction. The commandant's warning echoed in his mind, a cold and pragmatic voice reminding him of the immovable wall of the Church of the Riots. That would tear the city apart at the end of his own career, and likely his life, if he dared to challenge that ancient power. He had sworn an oath to protect the people of Seville, but another unspoken oath demanded he protect the fragile peace, a peace maintained by looking away from the rot festering in its most sacred place. He rose and paced the narrow confines of the room, his boots wearing a path on the worn floorboards. His hand went to the hilt of his sword, a weapon meant to defend against tangible threats. Not the spectral, sanctioned evil that operated under the cross and cassock. He thought of Isabel's friend, the scribalina, and her meticulously gathered evidence knot. Wild rumors, but a cold, logical pattern that pointed inexorably downward into the earth beneath the cathedral. He thought of the families, their eyes hollowed out by a grief that was met with official silence and ecclesiastical platitudes. The setting sun cast long, accusing fingers of light through his window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like lost spirits. He stopped at the window, looking out at the plaza. The cathedral stood bathed in the dying light, its beauty a lie, its sanctity a shield for atrocity. He could almost feel the wrongness of it emanating from the stones, a vibration of suffering that hummed beneath the city's everyday noises. The commandant's words were the voice of the world, of survival, but the cries of the lost, though muffled by stone and fear, were the voice of his duty, and they were growing louder in his soul. A resolve, cold and hard, began to crystallize within him. It was not the fiery passion of a hero, but the grim acceptance of a man who knows he is walking to his own ruin. The system would not act. The church would not police itself. The command for justice would not come from above. If it was to come at all, it would have to come from him, alone. He would be stripped of his rank, branded a traitor to both crown and cross, perhaps killed in the attempt. But the alternative to stand by, to be a silent accomplice in his polished boots, was a damnation far worse. He turned from the window, his decision made. The captain would follow his orders no longer. The man would act. The city slept, wrapped in a blanket of uneasy silence. But in Elena's small scriptorium, a different kind of vigil was being kept. The flame of her single candle bent and swayed as she leaned over a vast, crackling parchment unrolled across her desk, its corners weighted down with ink pots and a smooth river stone. This was not a text she had been commissioned to copy. It was a relic she had borrowed from the diocesan archives, a set of architectural plans for the cathedral so old the ink had faded to a ghostly brown and the vellum had grown brittle with age. She had taken it under the pretext of studying the Gothic script for a project. Her scribes accessed a key that unlocked doors others could not even see. Her eyes, strained from hours of squinting in the poor light, traced the intricate lines that mapped the glorious public face of God's house, the nave, the transepts, the soaring chapels. But it was the spaces between the lines, the areas left blank, that now held her rapt attention. Her finger, smudged with ink, moved to the foundations, to the schematics of the crypts and undercrofts, long since sealed off and forgotten by all but the rats and the spiders. And there, in the oldest layer of the plans, drafted by the original architects centuries ago, she found them. They were not labeled. They were not meant to be found. They were a series of chambers sketched in faint, precise lines, spidering out from the main crypts like the roots of a poisonous plant. They lay deeper than the known catacombs, accessed by passages that were not indicated on any of the newer sanctioned plans. One chamber in particular, a circular room drawn with a strange, almost deliberate isolation from the others, made her blood run cold. Its rendering was too specific, its shape too purposeful to be a natural cavern or a simple storage space. It was a design, an intention. Her breath caught in her throat. This was the missing piece. This was the geometry of the horror she had only been able to map through absence and grief. The pattern of disappearances, the last sightings near the cathedral's shadowy recesses, the terrible muffled cry Raphael had described, it all coalesced around this single, terrifying point on the parchment. The whispers had a shape now, had a location. The truth was not just a suspicion. It was a chamber, drawn in faded ink on a forgotten map, a secret buried in the very bedrock of faith. The key was no longer just an iron object in a merchant's pocket. It was this knowledge cold and damning, now burning in the mind of a scribe who knew with utter certainty exactly what lay buried beneath the sanctity. The key was a splinter of ice in Raphael's palm, its weight both a dread and a compulsion. The moon had climbed high over Seville, bleaching the color from the world and casting the cathedral's spires in stark skeletal relief. The plaza was deserted, the silence so profound it felt like a held breath. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to bury the key in its terrible implications, to preserve the fragile illusion of his brother's sanity. But the memory of that muffled cry, a sound of such raw despair that it had seared itself into his soul, propelled him forward. He could not unhear it. He could not unknow it. He moved like a ghost along the side of the great edifice, his footsteps swallowed by the soft earth of the flower beds. The postern gate waited, a darker slash in the shadowed stone, just as he remembered from the desperate flight of his childhood games. Now it felt less like a gateway to adventure and more like the entrance to a tomb. His hand trembled only slightly as he fit the cold, intricate iron into the lock. The mechanism was stiff with age and disuse, but it yielded to the key's unique teeth with a series of heavy grating clicks that sounded like bones breaking in the stillness. The gate swung inward with a sigh of rust and resentment, exhaling a breath of air that was centuries old, carrying the scent of dust, damp stone, and something else, something faintly coppery and stale. The darkness within was absolute, a tangible entity that pressed against his face. He lit the small lantern he had brought, its flame a fragile, defiant heart in the immense blackness. The weak light did not illuminate the cavernous space so much as carve a small, trembling island of visibility out of the void. The familiar pillars became monstrous trunks, the distant altar a shadowy promise he had no intention of keeping. His destination lay in the opposite direction, in the oldest, most forgotten wing of the cathedral, where the stones were rougher and the silence felt heavier, more watchful. He found the door exactly where his brother's meticulous, Joyless habits had suggested it would be concealed behind a Mothaton tapestry depicting the martyrdom of St. Lawrence. The saint's agonized expression a grim foreshadowing. Tapestry felt greasy to the touch. The door itself was unadorned oak, banded with iron, and set flush into the wall so perfectly it was nearly invisible. There was no handle, only a keyhole as dark and deep as a serpent's eye. This was it, the source of the dread. The lock that matched the terrible key. Raphael's breath hitched. The silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. He could feel the wrongness of the place humming in the air, a low frequency of suffering that vibrated through the soles of his boots. He thought of Miguel, of the cold, polished man he had become, and a wave of nausea washed over him. This was his brother's secret. This was his sacrament. Steeling himself, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, Raphael, merchant of Valencia, inserted the black iron key into the darkness. The turn was smooth, wheel-oiled, and silent. With a soft, definitive thud, the bolt within retracted. He pushed, and the door swung open on silent hinges, revealing not a room, but a yawning mouth of blackness, a narrow descending staircase carved from the living rock, exhaling a breath of cold, earth-chilled air that smelled of the grave. The descent into his brother's hell had begun. The air that rose from the stairwell was a physical presence, thick with the chill of deep earth and the cloying, metallic scent of old blood. Raphael's lantern flame guttered violently in the sudden draft, casting frantic, leaping shadows that made the rough-hewn walls seem to pulse and writhe around him. Each step downward was a descent into a nightmare made real. The silence so profound it pressed against his eardrums, broken only by the ragged sound of his own breathing and the scuff of his boots on stone worn smooth by a terrible traffic. The stairs ended in a low, vaulted passageway that branched into darkness. A faint, rhythmic sound reached him, a soft, wet, dragging noise, followed by a low animal groan of exhaustion. It was coming from the left. His heart hammered a frantic tattoo against his ribs as he followed the sound, the lantern held before him like a shield. The passage opened abruptly into a circular chamber, and the light fell upon a vision from the deepest pits of damnation. The room was a charnel house of the spirit. Rust-stained manacles, large enough to hold a man's wrists and ankles, hung from iron rings bolted into the stone walls. In the center stood a heavy wooden table, its surface dark, and glistening in places, scarred with deep gouges and stained with patches of a brownish black that could only be one thing. Leather restraints dangled from its sides, the buckles crusted with something flaky and rust-colored. But it was the periphery of the room that froze the blood in Raphael's veins. Pushed against the wall was a small, rough-hewn shelf. Upon it lay a pathetic collection of personal effects, arranged with a chilling, meticulous care. A set of fine wood-carving chisels, their handles worn smooth by a craftsman's hand, Mateo's. A small, singed baker's pill, Carlos's. A delicate silver thimble, now bent and scratched, Isabel's. And a worn, felt cap with a single, pathetic feather, Lorenzo's. Trophies, mementos of souls purged. Each object was a life interrupted, a story ended in this foul pit. His horrified gaze swept the floor. Dark, irregular stains bloomed across the stone like obscene flowers, some old and faded, others startlingly fresh. A trail of them led from the table toward a dark corner, where a pile of soiled straw lay matted and stinking. And there, half hidden in the shadow, he saw them. Heavy iron chains, coiled on the floor like sleeping serpents, their links stained and their ends terminated in cruel open manacles. The reality of it crashed over him, a wave of such profound horror that his knees buckled. He caught himself against the damp wall, his stomach heaving. This was not a place of madness. It was a place of industry. A slaughterhouse, meticulously maintained, where his brother, the revered priest, had methodically broken human beings and collected the fragments of their lives as tokens of his work. The sanctity of the cathedral above was a monstrous joke, a beautiful lie built upon a foundation of agony and despair. Raphael stood in the heart of his brother evil, surrounded by the evidence of his captives, and the world he knew shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The air in the hidden chamber was a foul miasma of blood, sweat, and despair, but it was the scent of sanctity gone rancid that truly choked Raphael. He stood frozen, the lantern in his hand trembling, casting unsteady light over the implements of torment and the pathetic relics of stolen lives. The world had narrowed to this circle of hell, and at its center stood his brother. Father Miguel had his back to the entrance, meticulously wiping a long, slender blade with a cloth, his movements calm and precise, as if performing a sacred rite. He did not startle at the sound of Raphael's choked gasp, or the light that now flooded his private sanctuary. He simply finished his task and turned, his face a placid mask of serene inquiry, as if he had been interrupted in his study and not in the aftermath of an atrocity. There was no shock in his eyes, no guilt, no frantic attempt to explain the nightmare surrounding them.
Right.
His gaze settled on Raphael with a kind of weary recognition, as if he had been expecting this intrusion, this inevitable collision of their two worlds. He placed the cleaned blade on the table with a soft, definitive click, the sound obscenely loud in the tense silence. His hands, now empty, were steady, the hands of a surgeon after a successful operation. Raphael found his voice, a raw, broken thing that barely resembled his own. The words that escaped him were a strangled whisper, a plea for any explanation other than the one staring him in the face. Miguel, ... In God's name, ... What have you done? He looked around the chamber, his expression not of a man surveying a dungeon, but of a curator in a gallery of divine works. His voice, when it came, was the same measured, resonant baritone that had captivated thousands from the pulpit. But here, in this place, it was a profanity. "I am doing God's work, Raphael," he said, his tone one of patient instruction, as if explaining a simple truth to a slow child. "It is a difficult, thankless labor, but a necessary one. The world is sick with sin. It festers in the soul, a corruption that simple prayer cannot reach." He gestured with a slow, compassing sweep of his hand at the manacles, the table, the trophies on the shelf. This is the only language the truly corrupted understand. It is the fire that burns away the impurity. The agony I offer them is a gift. It is the path to a purity they could never find in the comfort of the confessional. And in their depths was a fanatic's unshakable certainty, a light that was not divine but deeply, terribly wrong. I am not their torturer, brother. I am their savior. I am giving them a chance to meet their God with a clean soul. The calm with which Miguel spoke was more terrifying than any outburst of madness could have been. It was the serenity of absolute conviction, a faith so warped and hardened that it had become impervious to reason or horror. He looked upon his brother's ashen, disbelieving face, not with shame, but with a faint, patronizing pity, as if Raphael were a child who could not comprehend the complex equations of salvation. He began to elaborate, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon delivered in this most profane of chapels. He spoke of sin not as a mistake to be forgiven, but as a parasitic entity, a spiritual disease that required radical, invasive treatment. The confessional, with its whispered absolutions and light penances, was a placebo, a comfort that allowed the sickness to thrive and spread. True healing, true redemption, demanded a far more severe medicine. It burned away the ego, the vanity, the worldly attachments that clouded a spirit's connection to God. His gaze drifted to the manacles on the wall, and he described them not as instruments of imprisonment, but as anchors. They held the body still, he said, so the soul could be worked upon without distraction. The screams that echoed in this stone womb were not cries of pain, but psalms of purification, the sound of the sinful self being scoured away. He believed with a fanatic's unshakable logic that he was granting his captives the ultimate mercy. He was sparing them an eternity of damnation by gifting them a finite period of unimaginable suffering. Their terror and their pain were the birth pangs of their new purified selves. He gestured toward the shelf of trophies, the thimble, the chisels, the cap. These were not tokens of victory, he insisted, but relics of transformation. They were the discarded shells of the sinners who had entered this chamber, physical proof of the lives they had to shed to achieve grace. He saw himself as a divine artisan, much like Mateo had been with his wood, but instead of carving saints from cedar, Miguel was carving purity from flawed, sinful humanity. His war was not against people, but against the corruption within them. His duty was to fight that war, no matter the cost, no matter how his methods were perceived by those who could not see the glorious necessary truth. He was not a monster. He was a martyr to a cause too holy for the world to understand, a loving shepherd guiding his flock through the necessary fire, and his justification was a fortress of twisted scripture and perverted love that no horror could ever breach. The architectural plans felt like a live thing in Elena's hands, the faded ink a map to a nightmare she could no longer ignore. The cold certainty of the circular chamber, its isolation on the parchment, burned behind her eyes. The hour was late, the streets of Seville hushed and shadowed, but a new, fierce energy propelled her forward. The time for quiet investigation was over. The evidence was no longer a collection of whispers and suspicions. It was a fact, drawn in stark lines on ancient vellum. She had to act now. She found Captain Alvaro not in his office, standing alone in the training yard behind the barracks, staring into the darkness as if trying to discern a shape within it. The moon caught the weary slump of his shoulders, the tight line of his jaw. He turned as she approached, his expression guarded, but the frantic intensity in her eyes made him straighten. Without preamble, she unrolled the brittle plans on a low stone bench, the corners fluttering in the night breeze. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da, her finger trembling not with fear, but with urgency. Stabbed at the unmarked circular chamber deep beneath the cathedral's foundations. Her words were a low, rapid torrent, weaving together the names, the dates, the last sightings, the pattern of sermons and disappearances. And now, the physical proof of a place designed for secrecy and containment. She spoke of Raphael's discovery, of the key, of the terrible cry from below, of the trophies that confirmed the fate of the lost. She painted a picture not of a madman, but of a system, horror operating with a chilling precision under the cloak of faith. Her voice never rose to a hysterical pitch. It was the cold, hard tone of a scribe reciting an irrefutable account. She was not asking him to believe her. She was presenting him with the evidence, forcing him to see the geometry of the truth he already knew in his gut. She finished, her chest heaving, the plans between them seeming to pulse with a malevolent life of their own. Her final words were not a plea, but a stark warning. Every moment they delayed was a moment Father Miguel remained unchallenged in his dungeon. Every hour of inaction was an hour another soul could be dragged into the darkness. The chamber on the map was not empty. It was waiting. It would not remain idle for long. The unseen network that protected him was powerful, but it relied on silence and fear. Their only weapon was to act, to shine a light into that darkness. Before it could swallow anyone else, the burden of that action now rested squarely on the captain's shoulders. And her eyes, wide and unblinking in the moonlight, demanded he finally shouldered it. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, offering little light and no comfort. In the cramped, lamplit confines of Captain Alvaro's office, shadows clung to the corners like conspirators. The air was thick with the scent of old leather, cold sweat, and the grim weight of the decision that had just been made. Before him stood three of his men, their faces set in hard lines, illuminated by the single guttering candle on the desk. They were not the entire guard, not even a full squadron. They were the few he trusted, absolutely men with families in the city. Men whose eyes had held the same helpless anger as his own when consoling the grieving. Men whose loyalty to justice outweighed their fear of the cross. Elena's map lay between them, the faded lines of the hidden chamber a stark accusation against the pristine vellum. Her words, cold and precise, still hung in the air, a detailed blueprint of horror. There would be no official orders, no sanctioned raid. This was an act of insurrection, a desperate strike against an enemy protected by divine authority and earthly power. Failure meant more than disgrace. It meant a traitor's death, and likely a swift, quiet end for their families. Success was a fragile hope, a chance to drag a monstrous truth into the light and trust that its exposure would be its undoing. Alvaro's voice was a low, gravelly whisper, each word measured and heavy. He laid out the plan with the clinical detachment of a man discussing a suicide mission. They would move under the deepest cover of night, when the cathedral was a tomb and the city slept its uneasy sleep. They would use the postern gate, the one Raphael's key could open, avoiding the main doors and their heavy, echoing bolts. Their objective was not to apprehend Father Miguel, near impossible task given his certain allies within the church's hierarchy, but to confirm the chamber's existence, secure any evidence, and God willing find any souls still trapped within alive. The men listened, their expressions grim but resolute. They asked no foolish questions about backup or legality. They understood the stakes. They were not soldiers on an official mission. They were ghosts about to haunt a house of God, armed with little more than lanterns, crowbars, and a desperate burning need to shatter the silence. As Alvaro finished, he met each of their eyes in turn, a silent exchange of understanding that bound them together more tightly than any oath. They nodded one by one, their faces pale but determined in the flickering light. The plan was set. The rescue attempt, a fragile blade poised to strike at the heart of the darkness, would begin with the next toll of the distant bell tower, marking the hour when even the watchmen dared not look too closely at the shadows around the cathedral. The bell's mournful toll faded into the night, its echo swallowed by the immense waiting silence of the cathedral plaza. The four figures, clad in dark cloaks that rendered them little more than shifting shadows, moved with a tense predatory grace across the cobblestones. Captain Alvaro led Raphael's key, a cold, heavy secret in his grip, its weight a promise of the nightmare to come. Behind him, his three most trusted guards moved like extensions of his own will, their hands resting on the pummels of their swords, their eyes scanning the impenetrable blackness for any sign of movement. The air was cold and still, the very atmosphere seeming to hold its breath. The postern gate was a darker scar in the shadowed wall. The key slid into the lock with a soft metallic sigh, the tumblers turning with a series of clicks that sounded like gunshots in the profound quiet. The gate swung inward, and the breath that sighed out from within was centuries old, carrying the faint, unmistakable, coppery temps of old blood and the damp chill of the deep earth. They slipped inside one by one, the darkness within the cathedral an almost physical blow after the thin moonlight of the plaza. Alvaro raised his lantern, its flame guttering in the sudden draft. The vast nave was a canyon of blackness, the pillars looming like petrified giants. The silence here was different from the outside world, a dense, watchful quiet that felt charged with malevolence. They moved not toward the altar, but away from it, into the older, more neglected sections of the complex, following the path Raphael had described and the ghostly lines on Elena's map. The air grew colder with every step, the scent of dust and disuse giving way to that other, more foul odor. They found the tapestry, the martyr's agony frozen in thread, and behind it the unadorned iron-banded door. It stood slightly ajar, a sliver of absolute blackness promising the horrors within. Alvaro exchanged a grim look with his men, a silent communication that said everything. He pushed the door open. The stench that rolled out was a visceral assaulta, thick, cloying mixture of blood, sweat, fear, and the stale, metallic smell of the charnel house. The lantern light plunged into the circular chamber, illuminating the tools of torment, the stained table, the manacles on the walls. But it was the corner, the pile of soiled straw, that drew their horrified gazes. She was curled into herself, a fragile bundle of rags and bone. Isabel. Her dress was torn and stained, her skin pale and waxy in the lantern light. A faint, ragged breath shuddered through her frame, the only sign that life still clung to the ruin of her body. One of the guards, a man with a daughter her age, let out a choked sound and rushed forward, his professional demeanor shattered. He knelt, his hands hovering over her, unsure where to touch without causing more pain. She did not stir at his approach, lost in a world of remembered agony. Alvaro's heart clenched with a mixture of fierce relief and cold, murderous rage. They had found one. But his eyes, sharp and assessing even through the horror, swept the chamber. The other manacles hung empty, open. The shelf of trophies still held the chisels, the thimble, the baker's peel, the beggar's cap. But there was no sign of the newest captive. No sign of Lorenzo. The chamber, for all its evidence of past and present horror, felt abandoned. The monster had been here, but he was gone, and he had taken his latest project with him. The rescue had succeeded in finding a victim, but the hunt for the predator and his newest prey had only just begun. It's the faint metallic scrape of the distant door. The tremor of boot falls on the stone stairs. Above these were not sounds that belonged in his sacred workshop. Father Miguel froze, the damp cloth he'd been using to wipe a speck of rust from a manacle hovering in midair. His head tilted, a predator catching a foreign scent on the wind. The rhythm of the steps was all wrong, not the familiar, solitary cadence of his own descent, but the synchronized, cautious tread of multiple men, authority, intrusion. A cold serenity settled over him. It's the same focused calm that guided his hand during his work. The time of purification here was over. The world's corruption had finally come to pollute his sanctuary. He did not panic. Panic was for the sinful, the unenlightened, simply assessed and acted. Lorenzo, chained and broken in the corner, whimpered softly, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Miguel's eyes passed over him without a flicker of emotion. The beggar's soul was only half scoured, a project left regrettably unfinished. He moved with an unhurried efficiency that was more terrifying than any frantic rush. Crossing to the far wall, he pressed a sequence of stones that appeared no different from any others. With a soft, grinding sigh, a section of the wall pivoted inward, revealing a narrow, pitch-black fissure in the rocca, secret exit, known only to him and the original architects of this hidden place. The air that whispered out was stale and carried the faint, dry scent of the earth's deepest bones. But before he vanished into that waiting darkness, he paused. His gaze swept over his chamber one last time, not with regret, but with a final, calculated gesture. From within his robes, he produced a small, folded square of vellum. It was not a map to his location, but something far more damning, a list. Written in his own precise hand of initials and coded sums of money, a ledger of complicity. Did not hide it. Instead, he placed it squarely in the center of the scarred table, weighing it down with the heavy blood-crusted iron he had just been cleaning. It was a breadcrumb left for the wolves, a deliberate clue pointing not to a lone madman, but to the unseen network of corrupted clergy who had enabled him, who had turned a blind eye for a share of the donations his fervor inspired and for the silencing of troublesome voices. He glanced once more at the whimpering form of Lorenzo, a frown of divine disappointment touching his lips, a soul left imperfect, failure of his ministry. Then, without a backward glance, he melted into the fissure. The stone door sighed shut behind him, sealing seamlessly with the wall, leaving no trace of its existence. The only evidence of his flight was the open manacles, the lingering stench of pain, the barely living woman on the straw, the folded vellum on the table, a silent, explosive testament to the fact that the monster of Seville was not alone, and his escape was merely the beginning of a far broader revelation. The news broke not with a thunderclap, but with a carefully orchestrated whisper. A controlled leak designed to shape the narrative, before it could take on a life of its own. By dawn, the story was being murmured in hushed, horrified tones across Seville. Captain Alvaro and his men had raided the cathedral, finding a torture chamber and a single broken survivor. But the official response from the archdiocese was swift and surgically precise. A statement was read from the cathedral steps by a pale, stern-faced Monsignor Valdez, his voice ringing with a practiced blend of sorrow and condemnation. He expressed the Church's profound shock and devastation at the unimaginable and blasphemous actions of one rogue priest. Father Miguel, he declared, had acted alone. A wolf who had cunningly disguised himself in shepherd's clothing. His monstrous deeds a personal perversion of faith that had tragically escaped their vigilant oversight. The Church was a victim, he implied, its trust and sanctity violated as grievously as those of the missing. Behind the immaculate stone walls and polished oak doors of the Archbishop's palace, however, a very different scene unfolded. The air in Monsignor Valdez's study was thick with the acrid smell of fear and burning parchment. Father Guillermo scurried like a startled beetle, feeding document after document into the hungry flames of the hearth-misdirected inquiries. Vague reports of overzealousness, any scrap of paper that could hint at prior knowledge or willful ignorance. Their faces, usually masks of placid authority, were sheened with a cold sweat. The carefully maintained facade of infallibility had been cracked, and the scandal threatened to pour through, drowning them all. Couriers were dispatched at a gallop carrying tightly sealed letters to sympathetic officials in Madrid and Rome, letters that spoke of a local tragedy being exploited by overzealous civil guards of the need to protect the Church's universal mission from the hysteria of a single city. Donations from wealthy, devout patrons were suddenly and quietly called in, a financial bulwark being erected against the coming storm. The primary goal was no longer justice or truth, it was containment. The monster had fled his cage, but the greater institution could not be allowed to burn with him. The public face was one of grief-stricken innocence, but the private scramble was a desperate, ruthless battle to bury. The truce to ensure that when the dust settled, only one man would be held accountable for the rot that had festered with their silent, complicit blessing. The world returned to Isabel in shards of agony and fractured light. The first sensation was the clean, crisp scent of linen, stark and jarring contrast to the foul miasma of the chamber that still clung to the inside of her nostrils like a phantom stench. Then came the dull, all-encompassing ache that seemed to radiate from her very bones. A symphony of pain conducted by a cruel maestro whose face was the last thing she wished to remember. She was in a small, whitewashed room, sunlight filtering through a high, barred window, a room in the guard's infirmary, though she did not know it yet. A gentle-faced woman was dabbing a cool cloth to her forehead, her touch feather-light, yet it made Isabel flinch violently, her body reacting to any contact, as if it were the precursor to fresh torment. Captain Alvaro stood in the corner, his presence a large, still shadow. He had waited for this moment, the moment when the fragile thread of consciousness would stitch her back to the world. He needed her words, her testimony. To be the weapon that could shatter the wall of silence the church was already building. But seeing her there, so small and broken in the narrow cot, her eyes wide with a terror that had not yet receded, he felt the weight of his duty like a physical burden. He was not just a captain seeking evidence. It was a man asking a victim to relive her hell. He approached slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, and knelt beside the cot so he would not loom over her. He did not press, simply waited, his silence an invitation. And slowly, haltingly, in a voice scraped raw from screaming, the story began to emerge. It was not a linear narrative, but a series of horrific vignettes, each one a fresh wound ripped open. She spoke of the darkness first, the absolute, suffocating blackness of the blindfold, how it made every sound magnified and monstrous. The scrape of a boot on stone was a landslide. The drip of water was a deluge. Then came the sounds of his preparations, the soft clink of metal instruments being selected from the shelf. The methodical, almost reverent way he would arrange them, a liturgy of pain. She described his voice, the most chilling part of all. It never rose in anger. It never wavered. It was the same calm, measured baritone he used from the pulpit, but here it was used to explain the purpose of each new agony, to narrate her own destruction as if it were a spiritual lesson. She spoke of the cold bite of the manacles, the searing pain of the blade, the relentless, focused nature of his attention. He was not frenzied. He was meticulous. A craftsman who would pause sometimes, his head tilted, as if listening for some change in the quality of her screams, some sign that the corruption was being successfully excised. His breath on her neck was steady. His hands, when they touched her to position her for a new torment, were dry and cool. The brutality was not born of rage, but of a terrifying, unwavering conviction. He believed with every fiber of his being that he was saving her, that her suffering was a beautiful, necessary gift. Tears cut clean paths through the grime on her cheeks, but her voice grew steadier as she spoke. As if the act of giving words to the nightmare was somehow robbing it of its power over her, she described the moments of lucidity between the waves of pain. How she would hear faint, echoing cries that were not her own, the ghosts of Mateo, of Carlos, their suffering woven into the very stones of the place. She had given up hope, had retreated into a small, silent corner of her mind, believing she would die there, another forgotten sinner, purified into nothingness. Captain Alvaro listened, his face a stone mask, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the cot. Her testimony was more damning than any piece of physical evidence. It was the human truth of it, the portrait of a monster who saw himself as an angel of mercy. Her words did not just describe a crime, they defined a new kind of evil, one that wore the face of divine love and spoke in the language of salvation. When her voice finally failed, fading into exhausted sobs, Alvaro gently covered her hand with his own, a silent vow. Her ordeal was over. His and the city's had only just begun. The hunt for Father Miguel began not with the trumpet's call, but with a frustrated, grinding silence. Captain Alvaro and his small, trusted band of guards fanned out across Seville, their movements sharp and purposeful, yet each door they knocked upon, each shadowed alley they scoured, seemed to close just before they arrived. The city, usually a vibrant tapestry of life and sound, had become a maze of averted eyes and sealed lips. It was as if the very stones of the streets had been warned of their approach, as if the monster they sought had evaporated into the humid Andalusian air, leaving behind only the chilling echo of his deeds. Their inquiries, once met with fearful whispers, were now met with blank, uncomprehending stares or swift, firm denials. The shopkeeper, who had once nervously mentioned seeing the priest near the river at odd hours, now claimed a faulty memory. The old woman who swept the steps near the cathedral's side gate suddenly found nothing of interest to report. The usual informants who thrived in the city's underbelly had grown deaf and blind. A wall of quiet, impenetrable compliance had descended, a barrier far more effective than any physical fortification. It was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of protection, a coordinated, unspoken pact to shield the fugitive from earthly justice. Alvaro felt the truth of it like a cold stone in his gut. Miguel's escape had not been a desperate, solitary flight. It had been a carefully managed extraction. The folded vellum left on the blood-stained table was not just a clue, it was a taunt, a glimpse of the powerful, unseen web that had always surrounded the priest. The church's public condemnation was a beautifully crafted lie, a performance for the masses. In the shadows, a different machinery was at work, one of whispered orders, diverted glances, and swift, silent arrangements. Miguel was not a lone wolf. He was a valuable, if now compromised asset, and his network was moving him, hiding him in plain sight, ensuring that the hunt would be a fruitless chase through a city that had been instructed to see and say nothing. The real monster was not just the man, but the institution that had created him, enabled him, and was now conspiring to save him. The folded vellum on the blood-stained table was a serpent waiting to strike. Captain Alvaro handled it with a reverence reserved for explosives, his fingers careful not to smudge the precise clerical script that covered its surface. In the stark light of his office, far from the damp horrors of the underground chamber, the document seemed innocuous, a dry list of initials and sums, a ledger of donations or expenses. But each entry was a key, and each key unlocked a door to a deeper, more pervasive corruption than he had ever dared to imagine. The initials were not those of merchants or pious widows. They were ecclesiastical: FGMVRS, Father Guillermo, Monsignor Valdez, Father Rodrigo. The sums were not round numbers, but odd, specific amounts like payments for services rendered. And next to some entries were dates that corresponded not with church festivals, but with the disappearances. A payment to FG matched the week Mateo vanished. A larger sum to MV, aligned with the period when the civil guard's first tentative inquiries were abruptly shut down, was a map of complicity, a financial trail of blood money and silenced conscience. Alina, her face still pale from the horrors she had helped unearth, pored over the document with him, her scribe's eye-catching nuances his soldier's gaze might have missed. She cross-referenced the dates with cathedral ledgers she had secretly copied months ago, her fingers tracing the lines of official church accounting. The sums on the vellum did not appear anywhere in the legitimate records. They were ghosts, transactions meant to exist only in the shadows. Payments for turning a blind eye, for ensuring the flow of donations from a captivated congregation remained uninterrupted, for making problematic individuals vanish into the silence beneath the stones. The network was laid bare before them, not as a vague conspiracy, but as a cold, hard business arrangement. Father Miguel had not been a lone fanatic. He had been a producer of results, and these men, these pillars of the church, had been his silent partners, his investors, his protectors. They had profited from the fear he inspired, from the tides of a flock too terrified to doubt, and from the removal of those who asked too many questions. The monster in the dungeon was only the most visible symptom of a disease that had infected the entire body of the diocese. The folded vellum was not just evidence against a fugitive priest, it was a death sentence for the faith of a city. Proof that its most sacred guardians were not shepherds but wolves, who had been feasting on their own flock for years. The key was gone from his pocket, handed over to the captain with a sense of grim finality. But its weight remained, a phantom brand against Raphael's leg, a constant aching reminder. He sat in the quiet of his rented room, the sounds of a waking Seville drifting through the shutters, the call of a street vendor, the distant rumble of a cart-a-world continuing its mundane orbit, blissfully unaware of the abyss that had opened in its very heart. But Raphael could not escape it. The abyss was inside him now, a cold void where his understanding of his brother, a family, of the world itself, had once resided. His mind was a torturous loop, replaying every interaction, every visit, every faint flicker of unease he had dismissed over the years. The coldness in Miguel's eyes that he had mistaken for piety, the withdrawn silence he had attributed to scholarly contemplation, the way conversations about the city's troubles were smoothly, expertly deflected. He had seen the cracks in the facade, the subtle wrongness, and he had looked away. He had told himself it was respect for his brother's vocation, a merchant's desire to avoid uncomfortable conflict. He had chosen the comfort of ignorance over the burden of truth. And now that truth was a festering wound. He saw Mateo's chisels on that shelf. He saw Isabel's broken body on the straw. He saw the calm, certain fanaticism in his brother's eyes as he justified his chamber of horrors. And he saw his own role in it all. His discovery had been an accident, a stumble in the dark. He had not been brave, he had been curious. And that curiosity had unleashed a torrent of hell that now threatened to drown the city. If he had acted sooner, if he had confronted the strange coldness years ago, if he had dared to voice his suspicions instead of burying them under family loyalty, how many lives might have been saved? His brother's evil was his own, a monstrous growth from a poisoned seed. But Raphael's failure to see it, his willing blindness, felt like a sin of its own. He was not the torturer, but he was the brother who had looked at a monster and seen only a man. And in doing so, he had become, in some small, terrible way, an accomplice to the silence that had allowed the monster to thrive. The guilt was a shroud, heavy and suffocating, and he knew it was a garment he would wear for the rest of his days. The truth, once a whispered secret in shadowed taverns and fearful homes, could no longer be contained. It bled from the cracked facade of the church's official story, seeping into the sunlit plazas and bustling markets of Seville, fed by the captain's grim determination and the scribe's irrefutable evidence. It began with a single torn fragment of the horror Storia guard's wife, weeping over the fate of the seamstress Isabel. A baker, furious at the fate of his vanished apprentice. A merchant who had seen the grim-faced guards carrying something wrapped in soiled linen from the cathedral S-side gate. These fragments swirled and coalesced, finding shape in the folded vellum ledger. Its damning initials and dates, now common knowledge, passed from mouth to ear in hissed, outraged tones. The first stones were thrown not in anger, but in a kind of desperate, collective grief. They arced through the air, striking the magnificent oak doors of the cathedral, the sound a sharp, sacrilegious crack against the usual serene silence of the plaza. It was a sound that gave permission. A woman's wail, raw and piercing, rose above the murmur of the gathering crowd, a mother of one of the lost. It was a spark to tinder. The crowd, once a flock, became a mob. Their faith, the very bedrock of their lives, had been weaponized against them. The revered cross that had offered solace now seemed a mark of betrayal. The Gothic spires that pointed to heaven felt like fingers of accusation. Their cries were no longer whispers but a roaring demand for justice, a single word repeated like a drumbeat shaking the very foundations of the city. Justitia, Justitia. Windows in the buildings surrounding the plaza were shuttered in fear. The civil guard, vastly outnumbered, could only form a nervous, hesitant line, their allegiance torn between the enraged people and the crumbling authority they were sworn to uphold. The riots were not an attack on God, but on his corrupt representatives. The public outcry was a raw, wounded thing, a beast of grief and betrayal unleashed. It shook the Church's authority in Seville to its core, not by philosophical argument, but by the sheer visceral force of collective human anguish. The beautiful lie was shattered. All that remained was the ugly, screaming truth in a city demanding that someone, anyone, be held accountable for the blood sanctified by their own stolen prayers. The world had narrowed to the rhythm of a single bell, its tone deeper and more somber than the familiar peal of Seville's cathedral. Each measured toll was a stone dropped into the well of Father Miguel's new existence, marking not the hours of prayer, but the passage of a life now lived in the negative space of the one he had left behind. He was a ghost in a house of ghosts, a guest in the monastery of San Mateo, an ancient and isolated foundation perched in the arid hills a day's ride from the city. The air here was different, thinner, drier, scented with dust and time and the faint papery smell of old men and older vows. His arrival had been as silent as his flight. A hooded figure on a nondescript mule met at a moonlit crossroads by a brother whose face was hidden in the shadow of his cowl. No words were exchanged. A gesture, a turned back to follow, a journey made in a silence so absolute it felt like a continuation of the stone passage from which he had escaped. The monastery itself was a fortress of silence, its high, windowless walls a deliberate barrier against the world. Here, the outside did not exist. Here, a man could vanish. The brothers, a dozen or so aged men with faces like cracked riverbeds, asked no questions. Their eyes, when they briefly met his, held no curiosity, only a deep, weary acceptance. They knew, of course they knew. The news traveled even here, carried on the dry wind that whistled through the cloisters. They knew he was not a pilgrim seeking retreat, but a fugitive seeking sanctuary. Their obedience was not to him, but to the unseen network that had sent him, to the higher authority that commanded their silence. He was given a small, whitewashed cell, identical to all the others, containing a narrow cot, a crude wooden stool, and a crucifix on the wall, the bare minimum for existence, a palate scrubbed clean of all identity. Miguel accepted it all with the same serene detachment with which he had accepted his role in the catacombs. He joined their rituals, his voice blending with their reedy chants in the chapel, his knees meeting the cold stone floor for hours of prayer. He ate the tasteless gruel and dry bread in the refectory, his eyes lowered, his movements precise and economical. To an observer, he was the picture of humble penitence, a fallen soul seeking redemption in the harsh cradle of discipline. But within the walls of his own mind, the silence was not peaceful. It was a void waiting to be filled, and the only thing rushing in to fill it was the memory of sound. The sharp, precise ring of metal on metal, the ragged symphony of breath catching on a sob, the wet, tearing sound of a truth being ripped from a soul. In the absolute quiet of San Mateo, the echoes of his ministry were louder than they had ever been. The silence of the monastery, once a mantle of protection, began to curdle into an instrument of torture. In the cathedral's catacombs, silence had been a canvas upon which he could paint his divine purpose, a controlled element of his sacred work. Here, in this barren cell, the silence was absolute, and it belonged not to him, but to God or to nothing at all. It left no room for the justifying narratives, the theological frameworks that had armored his conscience. Stripped of his tools, his rituals, his pulpit, and his purpose, Miguel was left alone with the raw, unvarnished memories of his actions, and the silence gave them a voice more terrible than any scream. In the deep watches of the night, when the monastery was a tomb, and the only sound was the faint scuttle of a beetle on the stone floor, the faces came to him. They did not appear as they had in life, frightened, sinful, pleading. They appeared as they had been in their final moments, in the stark, lantern-lit truth of his chamber. Mateo's eyes wide with a betrayal so profound it had eclipsed the pain, the understanding dawning that his spiritual guide was his executioner. Carlos the baker's apprentice, his youthful defiance, stripped away to reveal the terrified child beneath, calling for a mother who could not hear him. Lorenzo the beggar, whose gratitude had turned to a confused whimper, unable to comprehend why kindness had become agony. But it was Isabel's face that haunted him most vividly, not as he had last seen her, broken and discarded on the straw butt. At the moment the blindfold had been tied, that single fleeting look of dawning horror, the absolute shattering of trust, the silent question in her eyes. Why? He had answered that question 1,000 times with his twisted theology, but here in the crushing silence the answers rang hollow. The chisel, the flame, the blade, they were not tools of salvation, they were just tools. The screams were not hymns, they were just screams. The purity he thought he saw in their agony was just the emptiness of a soul pushed beyond endurance. A cold doubt, thin and sharp as a needle, began to pierce the fortress of his certainty. What if Father Alonso, his mentor, had not been a prophet of a harsh truth, but merely a cruel old man passing on his own sickness? What if the pain was not a path to God, but only pain? The thought was a heresy more terrifying than any he had ever punished. It unraveled the core of his being, leaving him naked and shivering in the monastic chill. He was not a divine surgeon. He was a murderer, was not a savior. He was a monster. The faces of his victims watched him from the darkness, their silent accusation a judgment more damning than any earthly court could ever deliver. For the first time since he was a boy kneeling on cold stone, Father Miguel felt the true searing bite of agony not in his flesh but in his soul, and there was no purification in it, only a desolate, annihilating truth. The stone walls of the monastery seemed to press inward, each day a tighter vice around the conscience of Brother Mateo. He was an old man, his joints aching with the damp that seeped from the ancient rock, but it was a deeper, more spiritual ache that truly plagued him. He had been the one to receive the hooded fugitive, to lead him silently to his cell, to place the daily bowl of gruel outside his door without a word. He had followed the orders delivered in a sealed letter from a bishop whose name he dared not speak. His lifetime of obedience demanding compliance, even as his soul recoiled. But the silence of the monastery, once a comfort, had become saturated with the unspoken horror of the man in the eastern cell. The news from Seville carried on the dry wind, and in the hushed, terrified whispers of the few travelers who sought sanctuary, painted a picture of such profound evil that Brother Mateo's faith, once as solid as the mountain upon which the monastery was built, began to fissure and crack. He watched Father Miguel during prayers, noting not the humble posture of a penitent, but the terrifying stillness of a predator at rest. The distant, vacant look in his eyes that seemed to gaze upon some internal hell of his own making. The man was not seeking forgiveness, he was waiting. And in his waiting he was polluting the sacred silence of San Mateo with the spectral echoes of his deeds. Brother Mateo's dreams became infested with visions of chains and blood, of screams muffled by stone, and he would wake with a start, his heart hammering, the taste of copper and fear thick in his mouth. The weight of his complicity became a physical burden, bowing his already stooped shoulders, making each breath a labor. When the captain's men finally arrived, their boots echoing with a grim purpose in the sun-bleached courtyard, it was not a surprise, but a relief. They moved with a quiet authority that spoke of a hunt nearing its end. They did not brandish weapons or make threats. They simply stood, their presence an unspoken ultimatum. The abbot, his face a mask of conflicted duty, met them with a tense silence, the letter of protection from the bishop, a burning weight in his hand. It was Brother Mateo who broke the stalemate. He stepped forward, his voice unused to such volume, cracking like old parchment as he addressed the captain directly. The words were not an accusation against the guest, but a confession of his own sin of silence, of turning a blind eye to evil for the sake of earthly obedience. He did not look at the abbot or the other brothers. His eyes were fixed on the captain's, and in them was a desperate plea for absolution that only the truth could provide. And with a shuddering breath that seemed to drain the life from his frail body, he gave it to them. He pointed a trembling, arthritic finger toward the eastern wing, to the cell at the end of the shadowed corridor. The final secret was spoken. The monster's refuge was revealed. The hunt was over.